In today's video, I asked ChatGPT the 5 best JavaScript tips that it has, and its answers, while pretty good, there are a couple of things. One thing I would disagree with, one blatant mistake, but we'll kind of get to that in just a sec. Here are 5 tips for writing better JavaScript code. Number 1, use strict mode. Strict mode is a way to opt in to a restricted variant of JavaScript. It eliminates some of JavaScript's silent errors by changing them to throw errors. So yeah, that is definitely true. And I think that strict mode is one thing that makes JavaScript more useful. But luckily for developers, with strict mode, it's automatically applied in a lot of different JavaScript configurations. So usually you don't need to kind of manually use strict mode, but it would be good to double check and make sure that whatever JavaScript configuration you're using, whether that's like through Next.js or Create React App or whatever it is, that it is using strict mode by default. So I think that is a fair tip number 1. Tip number 2, use let and const instead of var. I think that this is also a very good tip here. Let and const are block scoped declarations, which is true, meaning they are not function scoped, which is what it beat me to there, while var is function scoped. So use let and const when the variable's value will change, and use const when the variable's value is never reassigned. So I think there's a slight error there. It says, so use let and const when a variable's value will change. Actually, you only want to use let when a variable's value will change. Let is for a block scoped variable that it will change over time. Const is for a block scoped variable, but for a value that doesn't change over time. Now, if you have an object that is a const variable or const declaration, you can change values within that object, but you can't reassign it to a different object. All right. So slight error here with ChatGPT. Use let when a variable's value will change and use const when it won't change. And I think it's generally best practice to use const as a default, but then when you have to reassign a value to something else, or you will change that value over time, then you can use let for those declarations. And I would just kind of avoid var in most instances. Number 3, use arrow functions. Arrow functions are a more concise way to define functions expressions in JavaScript. They can also be useful when dealing with the this keyword, closures, and higher order functions. Yeah, so I think that this is a fair tip. I generally think that arrow functions can be less readable, and this is maybe a bit of a hot take for JavaScript, but I think arrow functions can generally be a little bit less readable than function declarations. So the difference between const my function is equal to something like that. This right here is a arrow function that just returns null. If you're just kind of going through this, it can be kind of hard to know what's going on here. But if instead you use a function declaration and you do something like that, of course, I might have this on 2 different lines here, so it would be even more readable. But I think that seeing this function declaration makes it much more readable that I am defining a function. I think you can lose that a bit with arrow functions. Now, don't get me wrong, arrow functions definitely have their place and they can be useful and they are a concise way to write JavaScript functions, but I don't think that your goal should always be going for writing a concise function. And I think most of the time, it's best to almost optimize your code for readability, as that's going to make it more extensible in the future for other programmers to work on and stuff like that. So yeah, arrow functions, they can be useful. And it does make a good point on with the this keyword. The arrow function actually can improve the behavior of the this keyword and can be helpful in those instances. But I would say generally, I wouldn't just by default use arrow functions everywhere. And my preference is actually to use function declarations. But if I need to change the behavior of the this keyword or something like that, I might purposefully use arrow functions for that function. But I think generally these days, arrow functions are a standard practice that people understand what they are when they see them for the most part. Number 4, use template literals. Template literals are a new way to define strings in JavaScript. They allow you to easily create strings that include variables with less syntax. Well, I totally agree with this. I love template literals. I think it's much better than like just concatenating strings together with like a plus sign. But let's have ChatGPT show us an example of using template literals. So can you give an example of tip number 4? And this is a cool part about ChatGPT. It remembers the context of your conversation. So it knows what I'm saying when I just say an example of tip number 4. All right, so it gives me 2 let declarations, first name and last name. I probably would have used const declarations here as we're not changing first name and last name. So that's what I would default to, going back to my point earlier. But it says in this example, the template literal using backticks in JavaScript, that's exactly how you create a template literal, are used to create a string that includes variables, first and last name. The expression side of the template literals are placed with the values of first and last name variables, respectively. The output of this code would be, my name is John Doe. And that is completely correct. And I think that is a great example. And then it also goes on to show another example here that will output, I am 25 years old. And that is totally correct as well. By using template literals, the code is more readable and maintainable than using string concatenation with a plus operator. And let me just ask ChatGPT, show an example of string concatenation in JavaScript. Sure, here's an example of string concatenation using the plus operator. So first name John, last name Doe. And yeah, this is a perfect example of string concatenation. So here you can see how this is probably a little bit less readable than doing something like this. This reads just as a nice English sentence. My name is first name, last name. And then this one here, you have to kind of go, my name is, okay, plus first name, go up, my name is John. And you have to remember to keep a space here. And then you add another space and then you add last name. So like this can be readable, but definitely less readable than just using this kind of template here. And then they show another example here. I am plus age plus space years old. So you have to keep the spaces in there. And it is definitely more tricky with string concatenation. So I do think that that is a very good tip here. And then number 5, use the spread operator. The spread operator can be used to spread an array or an object and allow it to be used in a new array or object, and can also be used to spread the elements of array and so on. And I definitely like this tip. I think the spread operator is a very good thing to use. And like it says here, they're not hard and fast rules, but good practices to follow. And I would go back and say that is definitely true for this arrow function here. Generally, they can be good to use, but I would not say it's like hard rule to follow. And I think function declarations can be more readable. And then it talks about some other benefits here. But let's get an example of the spread operator right now. So can you show an example of using the spread operator? Sure, here's an example of using the spread operator to copy an array. So it shows you the original array, and then it shows you a copied array. And you can see with the spread operator here, it uses these 3-dot syntax, prepends it to the original array label, and this effectively creates a copy of this array. And it says in this example, it kind of explains exactly what I just explained. And then it can also be very easily used to merge arrays here. So it creates a new array here, opening up the square brackets, and then it spreads array number 1 into the new array and array number 2 in the new array with the 3 dots, and it merges these arrays very easily with the spread operator. And then you can also do the very same thing with objects using the 3-dot syntax, the spread operator, prepending that to the label of your original object, and that will spread all the properties and values of the original object into this new object that it creates here. As it kind of explains here, this will be used to copy all the properties and values from the original object to the copied object. So that is a couple of good examples there of using the spread operator in JavaScript to create copies and merging objects. And there's a bunch of different things you can do, but you can see my specific videos on the spread operator for more understanding and examples there. So overall, I think those are 5 solid tips from ChatGPT on improving your JavaScript code and writing better JavaScript.